All righty, commissioners. Welcome back to the afternoon as Chair Harrington is passing out a document here.
Thank you.
Back in momentarily. There you go.
There are copies for the other folks in the room.
Okay.
Use trouble.
Okay, welcome back to the afternoon section of the Tuesday, November 12th, 2024 Washington County work session. Our first topic was to be so bold as to look at my agenda. It is the proposed supportive housing services reform analysis. So we'll turn it over to our staff experts.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chair. I am Erin Doyle, your Senior Government Relations Manager, and with me is
Molly Rogers, Director of Housing Services.
First, before we get started, I want to just acknowledge that Molly and I are representative of a large number of staff folks who did a lot of work to help put this information together. And I do apologize that it took so long to get it into the packet and into your hands, but we wanted to get much information, run through our subject matter experts as humanly possible before we presented this to you. But now that we have an official resolution that was passed by Metro Council, we wanted to come back and talk about, well, that resolution only gave direction to their staff to come back in December. What was directed will have an impact, and we've started to do that analysis. So thank you to LUT, housing staff, and anyone who's had to talk to me in the last week. This is what I focused on. As did Molly and her team, and as did Stephen and his team. And there's other departments we haven't even had a chance to check in with yet that are also impacted. So really quickly, what we want to do today is talk about what was proposed in the resolution and order. There is a sizable memo in the packet now. Half of it is a memo doing the analysis. The other half is a copy of the finalized resolution by Metro. So if you wanted to see it, not in track changes from what they proposed in October 17th, but the final version is attached to that memo. But for today's presentation, we're going to go through what the governance reform proposal would look like and how it would impact the work here at the county, the changes in uses that are proposed within that resolution and order, and the revenue reform scenarios, because revenue reform is also part of the resolution and direction to Metro staff to bring back. And so we've started doing the calculations and turning it into impacts to our programs. So we'll go through all of that as quickly as humanly possible, but it's a lot. So we're obviously here today to talk about what is proposed. And the question for your board to consider as we go through this is, what is your direction for the ongoing conversation about the SHS measure reform? And also, what further questions you have, as always. So we wanted to reground where we are. And Molly and I did not have a chance to confer on how we were going to present these. So I'm just going to talk till Molly tells me to stop. But essentially, what was promised when the ballot measure passed is we would work to make homelessness rare, brief, and one-time or non-reoccurring within the metro region to the point that revenues allow. And there were two populations that were intended to be served. We refer to them as population A and population B. Population A being those that are hardest to keep in housing, the chronically homeless that have significant attributes that make it challenging for them to find and maintain housing. And then population B, those that are on the brink of homelessness or temporarily homeless that we can provide immediate services to. As was the goals that were set out at the beginning was that 75% of the funds would be used to address the needs of those chronically homeless, and 25% of the funds would go towards that population B to prevent population B from becoming population A. And they set up target numbers of 5,000 permanent supportive housing placements and 10,000 households served with rent assistance and services to avoid homelessness. Of those large numbers, those are the regional numbers. Washington County is expected to meet about a third of those regional goals. The next slide is just to remind us of where we are in the timeline of the original ballot measure. And this slide is actually put together by Chair Harrington, who's been tracking things very effectively to keep it in the back of our minds that we are in the process of building towards a sustainable system. And we aren't that far down the timeline. We are only in year 4 at this point in time, and we have made significant steps in creating that continuum of care so we can reach people where they are and bring them into the system and provide the services that they need in the short and long term. Quite a set of accomplishments for Washington County. Again, this is where we started before we had revenues, those 2021, and this is what we've been able to build with the revenues we've received so far. There's a pretty significant growth, I think, no matter what metric you're using.
Just to add into this, I mean, you guys have seen this slide before, but for the context of today, this was for us to really analyze the potential reductions and impacts to our system. You see here what our system is currently at capacity, and essentially the reductions will erode and affect each of these buckets. So that's where this is where you see this mid and max that we will be talking about in many different permutations. Our housing capacity is really based on really it's essentially our Pop A and Pop B permanent housing placements, and then shelter units again are also serving both Pop A and Pop B. So when we look at the system we've built, it is a little bit difficult to start delineating specifically within Pop A and B, but we've done our best to really look at that within this within this rubric of which population has generally been served. But we wanted to honor the original measure goals of that 75-20. Back to you.
And the other thing, that does not show up well on the screen. There's a map underneath that. They are not dots floating in space, but they are the map of the metro region of within Washington County and where we have made investment.
We have taken a regional approach and really understood Washington County within these, I guess, where you see some color coding, 4 different color codes, and how we've delineated our our homeless system of care. So we have tried to the extent we can, looked at pod villages, looked at transitional housing, motel, project turnkey projects, as well as new shelters coming online, and how we've organized our outreach teams, how we organize our providers. It's within this spectrum. And so as we look at the potential reductions, we have to make sure we are keeping an eye on this regional disbursement, and also recognize that we would have to make some tough decisions at some point within just seeing how our system is being shaped across the county.
But I also think this slide is important in recognizing the work that we have been able to accomplish in that short amount of time. It's a lot of investment of staff capacity, not just within the county, but with our external partners at the cities and within the community-based organizations that provide the ongoing services at each of these locations have helped us find the complete set of resources to build and to maintain these opportunities for those that are served by SHS funds. So with that, we will talk now about what is being proposed to be changed by Metro through their resolution. And the first big area I wanted to concentrate on is an area we've had a lot of conversations around without a lot of details. And now we have a little bit more detail, but the governance changes. And I would say that what is called for in the resolution is a complete overhaul and redoing of everything related to the governance and oversight of SHS funding. Again, to ground us, there's currently a governance structure in place that has roles, responsibilities, and chartered intention. The first is a tri-county planning body. It's part of the terms of the ballot measure and part of the terms of the IGAs between the counties and Metro. It is intended to be that regional lens by which SHS goals are set, metrics are determined, and then create strategies for investment for the regional investment funds, which are 5% of the county receives its full bucket of funding and we're required to hold back 5% to go towards these regional programs. That's what the TCPB signs does and what their oversight and intention is to be that regional body. Then there's the SHS Oversight Committee, which is again created because of the terms of the ballot measure and through the IGAs with the county and Metro. This is the group that is dedicated to making sure we are meeting the obligations we have set for ourselves and that those tie back to those regional goals. Both the TCPB and the SHS Oversight Committee have members from Metro, from the counties, and from service providers. So a lot of expertise sitting in these meetings regularly, making sure that we are meeting the commitments that we made in the initial ballot measure. And the third governance structure that's in place is one that your board has talked about a number of times, is the intergovernmental agreement between Washington County and Metro. There are the same agreements, just change the names, for Multnomah and Clackamas County. And these IGAs provide a lot of terms of how we will interact as partners in creating a comprehensive SHS strategy. And that includes how we will coordinate, share data, what the tone of oversight is between Metro, the SHS Oversight Committee, TCPB, and the counties, how we will report back to all of those entities to make sure that this work is done in public and with the ability to be scrutinized and questioned, and then terms for any renegotiation of the IGA. Pretty standard stuff in an IGA, and that is how we have approached making sure we are meeting our obligations and holding Metro accountable to theirs. The resolution, however, takes a big swipe at 2 out of 3 of those things and then requires the renegotiation of the third. But essentially, the resolution asks staff to come back with a proposal to create one oversight body called the Housing and Homelessness Policy Advisory Committee, known as HPAC, which for some of us who are also dealing with state level issues gets a little confusing, but this is the Metro HPAC. From what we have seen, it looks like taking the model of JPAC, which does transportation for the region, and trying to place it down to housing and homelessness services.
Maybe we should start calling it H2PAC, since it's housing and homelessness.
I mean,
If that helps
Yeah.
with regard to other acronyms.
I think we've just run out of acronyms at the end of the day, and I think we've used HPAC throughout the written material, so I'll just stick with that for now. We can maybe raise that later.
Okay, I made myself laugh. It goes a long way.
So the areas of oversight that HPAC would have go beyond what the SHS Oversight Committee and the Tri-County Planning Body would currently have to do not just homeless services and SHS measure oversight, but also housing production oversight. We'll get into that a little bit more, but really getting into the world of housing development through how we plan and incentivize development of specific types of housing. And then looking at homeless services with a more regional, like taking everything up to the region and making everything guided by regional needs as opposed to those localized areas of concern where each county has to recognize where they are in the process of developing their continuum and system of care. Then the purposes that are stated in the resolution order really come down to having the HPAC create a regional housing and homelessness action plan, which would be another regional plan on top of what the TCPB has already created. It would allow HPAC to hold off on or set up an impediment to counties receiving their funding, because HPAC would look over our local implementation plans, make sure that they meet the regional action plan. And until they deem that it should be approved by Metro, our funds stay with Metro. And then finally, it would create a different manner of oversight of implementation and budgeting practices, all of which have been part of the work that we have done at the local level in coordination with our city partners and our community-based organizations and other service providers. So really kind of pulling everything back up to, did you meet Metro and HPAC standards, thus removing some of the flexibility at the end of the day. To dig even deeper, the land use and planning, it's much more robustly laid out in the memo, but really where we see it in the resolution and order, it calls for HPAC to integrate the housing production strategies, needed housing, analyses, and other land use processes into the regional housing and homelessness action plan. So what integration means could be all kinds of things, but really steps further than the legislative intention was around the needed housing analyses and the housing production strategies. As outlined in the memo, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis process that was adopted recently at the state and applies here in the metro region, or ONA, is a process by which the analysis is done to figure out how much housing is needed on a region by region basis. And then the state then hands back to each of the local jurisdictions within that region how much housing they should be providing to meet that housing needs. And then from there, the local government has to adopt a housing production strategy that is a set of incentives, not just development codes, that would incentivize those types of housing to be developed. And it's not just affordable housing that's being looked at. It is all levels of housing from lowest AMI all the way up to executive housing, depending upon the needs that are identified by the state. That has been intended to be a local process of state mandates that we have to meet and can be analyzed, and DLCD has tools for enforcement. So this reform proposal adds yet another layer of government between the work that we have to get done and getting it finalized and deemed appropriate. And the state has its set of tools for enforcement, which is a variety of things, from technical assistance all the way up to holding back grants. And Metro is now proposing that the HPAC be able to also financially incentivize that we meet their criteria through being able to hold back our local funds if our housing production strategies and development expectations are not meeting what is called for in the regional plan. Whether or not that matches with the state is also unclear from the terms of the resolution. So that was a lot of words, very fast, about land use. I'm happy to stop here and do my best to answer questions or note them and come back to you if you have them. But I'd just like to take a breath for you all.
Commissioner Treese has a question.
We haven't got to executive leadership presentation, but tomorrow night at Impact, one of the topics is the Regional Housing Coordination Strategy. It's called an introduction. It's for information only, but I bring this to the table because I think it has a direct relationship to what we're talking about here. So I just want to make sure that that's on everybody's calendar.
Well, then I guess I should make some of my comments now with regard to just the land use side. And it's one of the reasons why I handed the 2040 concept map. And for everyone other than these 8 people, there's plenty of copies in the back of the room. This is the adopted 2040 growth concept. Commissioner Rogers will join me in remembering a thing called Measure 2629 way back in the 2002 timeframe that meant that Metro could only affect the housing capacity in corridors and in the various centers and main streets. Those things that you see here in yellow and purplish colors. All the pale yellow, all the neighborhoods are off limits. According to the voters who have approved Measure 2629 and in November 2014, Measure 26-160. I didn't go so far as to make copies of that voter's pamphlet, but what it says for Measure 26-160 is retain prohibition on Metro required single-family neighborhood density increases. Now, That means the ordinance from 2010, which required all local jurisdictions to allow an ADU wherever, one ADU wherever there is single family zoning, still holds. But this means that these yellow areas are still no touch. This was drilled into my head. I already knew it before I was elected as a Metro councilor in 2006, but I stuck by it. And I stuck by it for 12 years, including with the November 2014 measure that, thank you, Stephen Roberts, for reminding me, because I had a panic moment a few months ago, thinking that was gone. So what the Metro Council would be doing, and I don't know how they would get away with this with a single, you can't have a measure with multiple, single subject, yes. But their intention, as demonstrated by this resolution, is to allow them to affect all these pale yellow areas, which the state has not given them that authority. But their resolution indicates they plan to seize it nonetheless. So that is the only reason I wanted to share that with you. Additionally, I would ask that we direct Ms. Angie to have a special meeting with city managers to go over this memo, which Erin has summarized to date, to ensure that all of our city partners, not just the ones in the metro jurisdiction, well, actually, the state law doesn't affect Banks, North Plains, and Gaston because their populations are lower than 10,000, nor does it affect Durham, but I think everybody else is 10,000 or greater. But those city managers, and I guess their attorneys too, I want to make sure they understand what this resolution is seizing. I've certainly done what I consider my best to highlight it to all of the mayors. But they need to see this change in methodology, change of responsibility on the land use side alone, irrespective of SHS reform. Thank you.
And Commissioner Treese, to the comment about MPAC, there is a requirement in the ONA process for Metro. There is a role and responsibility that was assigned to them to create that regional housing coordination strategy, which is not a housing production strategy like we have at the local level, but a way of making sure that we
It
have
blends into the UGR.
Yeah, it's part of the UGR process. So the way the law is written, there is the urban growth report must be completed. And then within a year, Metro has to update its regional housing coordination strategy, which falls in line with their traditional role of like having that regional lens as part of the process, and also puts a requirement on them. So that's where that impact conversation should be directed outside of this resolution.
Thank you for that clarification. I would also call our attention to the fact that the HPAC proposal does blur the lines with MPAC. I think that's also what I'm trying to point out here.
Yeah, that in the memo, I think it's pretty
Say that.
plainly laid out, but essentially by creating a new committee, just writ large, the impact to staff in staffing commissioners who would presumably be on the HPAC, and making sure that the MPAC and HPAC committee representatives that we have those robust
In sync,
conversations. It's a capacity issue that brings housing into it just adds a lot of people who have to track this from our staff in order to make sure that any commissioner on any of these committees is prepared and knows what lane they're in between MPAC, a proposed HPAC, JPAC, and every other committee you all serve
I
on.
think it shifts a burden, not just to staff,
Mhm.
but to the Board of Commissioner member, because that person needs to have expertise in land use and housing development policy.
As well as homelessness services, because that's the other H in
Yep.
the HPAC.
Well, I know how hard I've worked
Yeah.
to understand the SHS side of things. But this land use role takes it up a whole new level.
Yeah.
Beyond MPAC level.
Mhm. There's also just technical concerns about timing and making sure that the original proposed timing of HPAC work for updating things is every 5 years, whereas the urban growth report is every 6 years. So we end up really out of sync really quickly, and all of the things tie back to these things equally. So keeping track of all of this seems logistically challenging is the nicest way I can put that. Moving from land use, if everyone is ready, there's also governance reform for the SHS services included in what is asked of Metro staff to bring back. The number one is how much more regionalization in the goals and strategies is intended through this Metro resolution. As a reminder, we built our system based on where we were. We were not in the same place as Multnomah County or Clackamas County, and nor would we want Clackamas County or Multnomah County's system to be our system in Washington County. We have created local processes, local touch points, conversations with your board to make sure that we are meeting the community needs where we are and where we want to go. And bumping all of that up into a regional goals and strategies leaves us less capable of making sure those local programs are being effectively rolled out, capacities being built in the communities that we know that we must serve because we pay attention to what's happening in Washington County. It establishes more prescribed budget processes to be brought back, not just the when, but the how we budget, which has always been the purview of the local jurisdictions. And if we are stuck in their processes, we don't know how we can flex to changing circumstances as quickly if we have to modify what their process is in order to modify our own process, and how that then overlays with the work our finance team has to do in the budget setting process, and those timelines becomes even more complicated. One of the tools that this creates for HPAC is to hold our funds until our local plans are approved. And the concern there is if our plan is not approved in a timely enough manner, how do we then continue our contract obligations to our partners? And making sure that we are continuing to move the money through the system to make sure that the services are being rendered in a timely manner. And then while it is not stated explicitly in the HPAC resolution or the resolution, the between the lines and the conversation that I have seen happen at Metro Council imply that there is a potential for redistribution of revenues. Right now, the IGA between the counties and Metro divide the revenue based on how much we put in and how much we represent in the system. So we are a third. But if the regional goals and strategies say we need to meet X obligations, and those obligations are focused in other areas within the region, that means that there is an ability for HPAC to take a look at that and say the goals won't be met unless we put more money into name another county, name a city that is not in Washington County. And that concerns me greatly because that is how we make sure we have a longitudinal understanding of what our budget may or may not be and how we can understand a forecast. Requires us to have surety that they're not going to readjust the redistribution of revenues from year to year.
Doesn't that, how does that square up with how the revenue is generated on a by county? I mean, wasn't that part of initial SHS measure is that you get a proportional amount back.
Don't recall if it was in the measure and I left my giant binder upstairs.
There is language in the IGA that Metro could reintroduce the concept of redistribution at some stage.
But they would have to call in the counties to have that conversation. That's the other part of it. So it's part of the IGA. I don't believe it's part of the ballot measure.
Keep in mind, this measure will replace
Yep.
those terms.
Yep. And so all of this leads to the governance structure that currently exists between the two bodies and the IGAs. The two bodies would be disbanded and the IGAs would essentially be moot because they wouldn't relate.
Nullified.
Yeah. So it would require
without county agreement.
a new IGA to be negotiated, and I don't envy Courtney in those conversations. But I do recall how long it took and how much capacity within the county to create the initial IGAs was excessive, not excessive, it was extensive.
Took approximately 9 months.
With people representing general counsel's office, housing, GR, finance, and a few other departments alone, administration. So that is the section on governance. Are there further moments that the board needs to discuss what we just talked about? The next big thing that is called for in the resolution is to create some additional uses for these funds. In particular, adding the ability to use this as capital for housing development and then adding a direct city allocation. The impacts of this are so unknown for us right now because we don't know how they're going to accomplish either one. For purposes of the housing development, the revenue impacts of the county really depend upon how they determine how much money goes towards the affordable housing development and when that money is taken out of the system. So these are 4 options that have been discussed at various times in this last year of these conversations. Some more impactful than others. If there's a mandatory set aside that's taken off the top, and that means we just flow from there, we could know what that is from year to year, how that money then gets partitioned out. Again, big question mark. Option 2 has been talked about, and I use the word extra in quotation marks because I think we have clearly established that is not a thing that we had. But basically, instead of having carry forward funds that could be used in the next year to add capacity, they would be swept back into and put into a separate account dedicated towards the development of affordable housing. Option 3 is the one that creates the most flexibility for the county and says, county, you can take your full cut of the revenues and you can add affordable housing into your plans. And option 4 is one that I think is very concerning for purposes of understanding impacts to our revenue, is if they just hold us at that initial 250 million and everything above that goes into an affordable housing program. Commissioner Raleigh, I saw you had a question.
Yeah, I guess, whose 4 options are these?
These options are ones that we've heard in various points in the conversation around SHS reform as they've talked about adding affordable housing. So we've heard this from various stakeholders at the table, multiple Metro counselors, multiple other stakeholders in the process of how revenue gets built. You know, name your person, they've got an idea.
Well, so that's why I guess you clarified it on option 4, but option 2 to me, listening to the conversation previously, is extra would be the amount over 250.
I think it depends upon how you define what the price. So option 2 is different from option 4 in that it could be of the third that Washington County gets, anything we don't spend in that year that isn't mandatory reserves is deemed extra and swept back to be used in an affordable housing. Whereas option 4 says 250 million is the only amount you can spend on services. So there's more flexibility in option 2 than option 4, but again, takes it out of our control of how we prioritize. And one of the things in conversation with Molly over the weekend is we have been trying to set up a continuum of housing opportunities to move people from chronic homelessness into permanent housing. And there are steps that an individual needs to go along the way. And when we prioritize and front load permanent supportive housing like this, we are saying step 5 comes before step 2, which is moving someone from a transient location into some version of shelter. So how can we build people, how can we move people through the system if we're only building step 5 of the system? And so this is where we become very nervous about the ability to continue services while adding affordable housing, which I don't think that this board has ever said we don't want to do. It's just how we prioritize in year 4 versus year 7 of where we are in the system of moving people through the system.
Question on option 2,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not clear where the sweeping is going, but I presume if it's going to Metro, then
No.
is, no?
Well, it could go
Well,
back
it
to
could,
that.
it could not, it can be either one, sorry. It's when our providers spend less than their contracted amount. And so there's that, it's an opportunity for a one-time only excess of funding. We would propose it would come back to the counties. We could say it could go into a capital fund. It could, Metro could say that unspent funds should go back to Metro and they redistribute as.
You're clarifying, because that isn't very clear.
No, both options are open.
Yeah, it's sweeping,
Everything is possible.
yeah, we don't know what fund we're talking about because the fund does not
So
exist.
to meet the ballot measure, do the funds have to be recharacterized as to the nature to do that, or is that permissible?
Currently, the Metro Council as an attorney has put forth an opinion that we cannot use these funds for capital construction costs
Of affordable housing.
of affordable housing. So this would require a ballot measure in order to amend the language that Metro's attorneys have said limit the ability to spend this. This was an initial concept that Washington County was trying to pursue in one of our notices of funding availability, but we were quickly told by Metro that's not an allowed use. So they would like to make it an allowed use. And in addition to that, perhaps, and very clearly set aside some money because the bond is tapped out.
So option 2, I'm just picking on that one, is open. I just heard that. And how I use recharacterization is how I use it in accounting or a lot of tax law, you do it too. Yeah, are they recharacterizing it to say it's something different than it is? Or that's not the case?
I'm not sure that I understand what recharacterizing means in a CPA's terms.
Okay, what happens is that you have income that maybe has specifically designated application of the revenue. So you recharacterize it so it has a different kind of notation or a different purpose so that you can spend it for what you want to spend it for. So you're changing the meaning to get out of the initial purpose for which the money was raised. So you're recharacterizing it so it doesn't say that's what it is. For instance, I give you an example. If you had the example you gave me where gee, we had some extra funds because we had underspending, I don't call that any sort of monies collected under the program. I call that recharacterized income that is from lack of expenditure.
So Metro has said we cannot use, no matter how we account for the dollars, SHS dollars to build affordable housing.
So they're still calling.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
Yeah.
we're not changing the title of it.
Correct.
So in
All right.
order to do that, there would need to be a ballot. There would need to be a change on a measure.
So the big questions that remain open besides how is who is served and how much does it actually buy? Because if it's like an extra $2 million a year, I'm fairly certain that Molly can tell me that when you put together a funding stack, $2 million is not going to buy you very much in affordable housing unit construction. Might be helpful for
Maybe in
tipping.
3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
something like that.
So those are big questions that remain.
4.5, sorry, you. Man.
Yeah, I mean, I could personally,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's what I'm not the target audience. The second area, where the resolution calls for a change in use is to create a city program, which is a direct allocation to all of the cities within Metro. Each county has approached its relationship with its cities differently. Some are more popular, systems from the city's perspective than others. I think we've worked really hard in Washington County to have that comprehensive conversation. I know that Molly's team has collected the expenditures we've made in cities, but we've really tried to focus in on what it is that our region, our county needs, and how our cities can partner in us with meeting that. If there becomes a dedicated funding stream, there's a lot of unknowns. The eligibility restriction is really expanding allowable uses as necessary. So going beyond what we currently can spend the money on with a focus on those experienced or at most risks of chronic homelessness, which is very different wording than what we face. The other big question mark that's not clear is how much of the purported entire revenue bucket is set aside for the cities. And again, the question is, what does that buy them? We've heard various figures from like just $1 million to spread across the 20 some odd cities in Metro. That's not gonna get us very far down the road, to who knows how much. Let's negotiate that term. And the challenge for us then gets compounded. Not only is that a potential revenue loss for the county because it comes out of the system before we get our percentage, we might have to re-examine then how the cities are spending that and how that does or does not coordinate with the county-wide systems we are trying to create, as well as the direct contracts that we have with our cities in order to provide for the development of shelters, the operation of shelters and pods and all the other systems of care, which puts us in a really contentious place with our city partners and makes it even harder for us to feel that joint success, because what could be done is a requirement for a conversation with our cities, which is what we already do here in Washington County and has proved challenging at times, but effective at the end of the day. So as further we chip away at what the revenue has to be used for, the less revenues we have to put into our system. So these change uses have profound impacts depending upon their size and how they are managed and who is managing them and how that then has to coordinate with our system. Oh, so many slides. Now I'm going to make Molly do a bunch of talking because she knows her budget. But I'm just going to go through the revenue reform scenarios. Include indexing, rebasing the who pays in, and adjusting the rate, or a combination of all three. I put the star here because we have focused on what it looks like in these scenario plannings with a combination of all three, of rebasing plus indexing over time plus a rate change, because that is what the resolution leans into. The other thing the resolution does is it allows for staff to recommend a phased reduction in the rate, which gets even more complicated. And I'm going to tell you, we didn't do that math because I don't want to. We did a lot of math already. Again, the star is the indexing and rebase, but the minimum impact to Washington County's revenue is if they merely indexed moving forward at about $1.2 million. The largest impact is an indexing plus rebasing plus a 30% reduction in the tax rate, which costs Washington County $22.38 million. So math is good. This table is a lot of numbers, but we really concentrated on the scenario information we're providing on that indexing plus rebasing plus tax rate reduction, and use those numbers in the rest of the charts. From here, I'm going to turn it over to Molly.
So just taking a step back, this was actually this is a very challenging exercise that we've gone through, and this is just the first of having many dialogues and discussions of the impacts to our system. So this is us honoring some draft guiding principles that we've brought forward to you. We've previously discussed, we've talked about this with our Solutions Council as well. But we need to make sure whatever scenarios we talk about in terms of reduction, we want to make sure we're honoring the initial 75-25% split between Pop A and B. We also want to look at racial disparities and equity and when we make these reduction recommendations. We need to look at, to Aaron's point, we built a system with many different through points. So people experiencing homelessness can be captured in various different ways and meeting whatever makes sense to them and what they feel comfortable with. I don't believe we should have a system that completely cuts out one intervention point. I think that would be a disservice. I think that we've seen an effectiveness, but we've also built a system that has a through point that gets people towards permanent housing as its end.
And when you say intervention point, you're talking about whether the different types of housing or shelter that may be available.
And also how they're coming into the system. Okay. So we're coming in, we're trying to balance a centralized versus decentralized system because people may be showing up homeless with their church or faith place, or they may be showing up through our community connects. We need to be able to have enough of a coordination across folks who are experiencing homelessness. SHS was meant to be that operating source, the operating fund, the ongoing rent, ongoing services, because that was the biggest gap we had seen in our whole system. Those of us who have been working in this arena for 20, 30 years, that's been the linchpin of any kind of program. We could always get one-time only money. We could always get biennium money. We could get money for great one-time purpose. We couldn't figure out how to use it in a way that sustained people in housing over time. So this has been blurred. Going into a production fund or the use of capital has a little bit blurred the initial purpose of SHS. And we are using it strategically to do some capital because we had we had very little infrastructure when we first started. So we've had to be able to use that for, say, transitional housing and shelter. But I just want us to lose the initial mission there. So we're balancing quality and quantity. We are going to continue seeking funds from other funding streams. So every scenario we're going to talk about here is not what's going to actually happen, because we are going to do things to prevent as much of these cuts as we can, but we will continue to seek more state funding or federal funding as much as we can to try to offset any potential cuts. We are here where we are is what we know today. And what information we have. The other thing to make a point. Yes,
Sorry,
Sarah?
before you move on to this slide, after you take us through all these slicing and dicing and really understanding the potential effect, can you bring us back to the guiding principles, especially with regard to next steps?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not trying to, let's keep going through the flow.
Yep. First of all, I need to remind your board that you're already in a place where we need to be making program reductions. As I ramp down of this fiscal year and resetting what we call our baseline for next fiscal year. So right now, until we have what the next forecast is, we are anticipating that it could be a $10 to $15 million reduction of our $120 million budget for this year, or going into next year. So what that means is, like I said, a variety of things. For when we look at the indexing and rebasing and the potential of different tax cuts, we also assumed a 12.5% or $12.5 million reduction, just so that it captures reality. Just a little bit more context, just because, like I said, it was definitely a challenging exercise because there are many permutations and many different ways we can go about a combination of different programs. Do you do across the board cuts? Do you go deeper into some than others? And so we had to make a number of assumptions. So just to ground us here, like I said, this is not an actual recommended plan. These are just potential combination of scenarios that would need your guidance. We would need input from our Homeless Solutions Advisory Council and of course the providers to help craft any actual proposed plan. But because there are multiple rate reductions on the table, we had to look at it from a triaged approach. What would we do first if it was just what we call a haircut versus really deep, significant material impacts to our system? So you will see here a cumulative of impact to the number of people served, or fewer number of people essentially served. And a lot of these, just to ground us, we've got shelters that aren't quite on the ground yet. We've got transitional housing that we haven't built out. So some of these estimates are costs are simply estimates. Don't actually really know how the funds will, how the facility, how we need to forecast expenditures over time. So these will all change. We did base it on our guiding principles. And the one thing we have figured out is expenditures tend to do cost forecasting differently than revenue. They tend to outpace. And what we also have learned is rent tends to outpace, say, salaries. So we have to look at a combination of all those various different variables that come into an actual expense forecast. And none of these, because we're already at a reduction in terms of our baseline, none of these assume a new use for affordable housing or a city program. So that would be an additional further cut if we have to. Okay, without further ado, there's a little lot to each of these. But essentially, what we are focusing first on in this fiscal year as a ramp down and then going forward is that we're starting with the impacts of POP B. So we've been building out our permanent solutions for POP A. That's been our big ramp up in terms of actual infrastructure and building and acquiring properties. We've been able to direct more of our resources to POP B. That will have to get right sized going forward. That's just where we're at. So that means a significant reduction in eviction prevention and however we look at this. It also means we were able to put capacity building resources in, especially either smaller or newer nonprofits to help them grow alongside of us. We would no longer be able to offer that. We were also contemplating some new innovative kind of rental assistance programs, more targeted to POP B. So rent assistance that help stabilize folks as they say moved off of rapid rehousing in a shallower way than say our deeper rent assistance that we need to do for POP A. That would need to be that new program essentially will be eliminated. That would affect we were going to increase our overall system by about 500 households that we will no longer be able to do.
What does Temp Shelter Solutions POP A and B?
So we did some temporary, essentially vouchering or a sort of master leasing of some motels. In addition to the motels we purchased with Project Turnkey, we also did some sort of leasing of those motel rooms that were more of a temporary solution coming out of COVID. And it was using ARPA money initially, and those would need to get ramped down because we can no longer afford temporary solutions anymore. And then of course, we need to make sure we're building out the rest of our shelter capacity with shelters that are about to be under construction here.
So, just to understand the framework of this table, there's the 1% tax with just indexing and rebasing is 5.71.
Correct.
And then the 0.95 is the 8.49. And then you kept the 12 to 15 as a representation of the 12.5. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I gotcha.
Yep, there's a lot of math here, but essentially we use the 12.5 as our baseline, and then we use that last row and modeled out the 5.7 all the way down to the 22.34,
Okay.
38.
Yep. And if we go back to the next slide. No,
Oh, other way?
no.
Sorry.
You were on the one titled Revenue Reform Scenarios asterisk. That's the one I'm trying to get back to. There you go. I'm just trying to check a point. This is the potential cuts. And I get the fewer households served, but I want to confirm that we do stay committed to opening and staffing the Beaverton permanent shelter, which goes to closing out the temporary Beaverton shelter, but also for the committed Hillsborough permanent shelter and for the 2 access centers. Those continue despite these reductions.
Well, that is something we actually need at some point, depending on how deep the cuts go, we will have to reduce our shelter capacity from somewhere and our access center capacity from somewhere.
Oh, I see. Okay, so 50 fewer Pop A permanent housing placement. No. How do I see that in any of these bullets?
We will, so if we go through each one, you'll see a deeper and reduction that eventually does get to our shelter on the next slide.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll wait.
We
We
will
gotta
get there.
deep cut before we
Okay,
We will,
prioritize that.
at some point, we will have to look at those really hard choices. I don't want to sugarcoat this, but this was, like I said, a very difficult exercise because A, we don't know where they're going to land, but B, it's our fiduciary responsibility to inform the public that the further down we go, the overall system will be eroded and we will have fewer through points by which people get into permanent housing.
so we know we have to do the first row because of the revenue reduction.
Mhm.
And then there's adding the next row if they choose to just rebase and index. But then if they choose to change the tax rate to just 0.95, then we have to effectuate that too.
So it
Okay.
is a cumulative set of
Yep.
cuts.
Oy, oy, oy.
So I actually want to underscore that and say it a different way. Today, all things being the same, since our revenue has came in less than the economic forecast, the baseline 10 to 15 million, we will see that reduction. That is known today. That is a clear service reduction in our existing SHS program.
Can I ask, I shouldn't even do this, but I'm very curious. Revenue reductions, I suspect are coming out of another county. They're not coming from here. Is that right?
No, that isn't. What we're talking about because
just
of
us.
this 12.5 is just the overall tax collection regionally has come in less than forecasted last November. So the percentage of allocation works off of that number.
Yes, and I understand that, all that. But again, if you're aggregating it as a region,
Mhm.
if you disaggregated it,
Oh,
where are those losses coming from?
We'd have to do some research.
Because it's, and again, I guess I'm being chippy and I don't mean to be, but I would guess Washington County is not taking those losses. I think they're coming out of Multnomah County. And I think because we're aggregating, we're taking a hit because of those losses. And it's just interesting to know. I mean, you can't have a tax rate that's high. They have a very high property tax, very high, a lot of others over there. And it's going to have an impact and people are starting flight. We know that. That's what's going on.
And all these scenarios assume we'll continue to get our roughly 30% of the regional tax. I think we are experiencing probably more reduction than the other two counties because we were more successful in building up our system and getting the funds expended and our providers ramped up faster.
Zero, we were 100%, we still will get 30% of our own money. That's the point.
Yeah.
So
So
another discussion about, is it just 30% of the total revenue? Is it total? Or do you start looking at where raising money? If you really want to be fair about it.
yeah, they could get the city of Portland to do that analysis.
That would again require us to renegotiate the IGA.
No, I
So-
completely understand, but it's an intellectual exercise. You can say, wait a minute, where's this coming from? Okay.
So these are a series of from hard to more difficult decision points. But we are purporting that we would need to start most likely with the POP A additional services like employment services, like furniture services, helping people have furnished homes as they move into housing. Additionally, we've been putting a lot of additional funds into rapid housing. That's where folks who sort of are experiencing homelessness for not tied to, say, a long-term disability and are in a shelter and they can get an apartment and then they're able to get a job, maybe just a 2 year time period could get them back on their feet. We would need to bring those resources down. And likely we would close down a pod shelter when we look at where we were hoping to do temporary solutions because we made a commitment to those communities. We would move those every 2 years. So that would sort of accelerate some of the closing down of those. That's assuming Metro just indexes and rebases and does not do any tax rate reduction. So if they do a 5% reduction, we have to continue reducing, I'm guessing, some rapid rehousing, again, some more POP B resources. And that's when we would start really slowing what we are doing, more permanent housing resources with both that POP A and B have been utilizing of our regional long-term rent assistance program. Eventually the cuts could get so deep that we would only be able to move people in with ARLA through attrition. So as folks move off of ARLA, we would wait till there was enough resources for new vouchers to be issued. But that being said, we have budgeted to try to continue to keep up with our original goal of the 1,650 of POP A and closer to the 3,300 of POP B. This is where we start seeing our overall system capacity at that level that we talked about in that earlier slide would start reducing down. And then, of course, we would start talking about our outreach teams because we have 20 FTE dedicated to outreach dispersed across the whole county. When we have fewer housing placements, it means fewer outreach. Okay, 1%. 1% is where things do start getting more scary. So we have underway with SHS. We're not just SHS, and I want to say this, there's other federal funds that our cities have leveraged, and we have been able to use SHS to help bring those shelters to fruition in addition to state money. So SHS is great for operations, but also has been some strategic capital resources as we've been ramping up. But the ongoing operations of those shelters and access centers, you would need to make some form of cut that represents that order of magnitude of the level of operating, what it needs to operate those facilities. So it doesn't mean we're going to necessarily shut down one specific shelter. It means we need to find enough savings that has the amount of that operating budget that those shelters or access centers represent. The one thing that we have done more of is more tenant-based ARLA as we built out our permanent supportive housing. And the one thing that I've honored in this is that we are not going to kick people out of their housing that we've moved into housing. But it does mean some slowing of a system that we are in the midst of still building out. We would have to relook at potentially one of each of those and how we would cost save for those operations. It does mean we would probably likely see administrative cuts as well. That could be to our providers and to the county.
I'm really surprised that the impact to time, place, and manner doesn't show up until the baseline plus the 0.1 tax reduction.
That's because we were able to, the previous slide, we were able to absorb enough to not actually shut down a shelter site.
Ah,
And it's through our shelter system really, and our being able to have our e-beds, our emergency beds that law enforcement have access to, that we start seeing an eroding of that. Those cities could be affected by not being able to do their time, place, and manner enforcement.
okay.
So that is another impact, other loss to the system. And then of course we would lose, if we go to our we look at our 433 shelter capacity, we start looking at, now we've got 50 to 60 fewer. So now we're down to like 380. We know in shelters, we can estimate that about, for every shelter bed we have, about four people per year are served with that shelter bed. So we can look at the actual number of sort of on, just to estimate. For 60 fewer shelter beds, that means 240 fewer people served. And then again, we kind of keep going with each of these, we keep reducing outreach, we keep reducing admin. The baseline plus a 0.8. So now we go from 0.9 to now 0.8. So a 20% reduction. That's when we really have to start looking at the level of system alignment, staffing, and coordination that we have built out. So we have helped fund housing navigators. We've helped liaisons. We help the city. We fund some city liaisons. It starts questioning. It doesn't make as much sense to fund staff when we are closing down shelters. So these are some of the real time trade-offs that we have to really think through, depending on where essentially Metro lands.
Can you go back to the prior in potential loss to system?
Oh,
that
one?
column? No, not prior slide.
Oh.
Prior case. So potential loss to system column, first blue row, very last bullet. 1 out of 3 permanent shelter sites loses capital investment. So
this could be a worst case scenario that if we have to, we don't know which shelter.
but we do know we're opening the Beaverton one next Monday.
We are having a groundbreaking.
Okay.
And we're opening, yeah, sorry. And we're opening. So that obviously, sorry, we're still working on the groundbreaking for Hillsborough, sorry, and then Beaverton, we're opening.
Oh,
Thank you.
Beaverton's opening.
Yes,
People will be moving in.
correct. So we're not putting forth a particular site.
When is the Beaverton one targeted to have people going through it?
I would have to get back to you on their specific timeline, but their opening is next week.
Yeah, it's the opening, not groundbreaking. There was a,
I misspoke. Groundbreaking.
Okay.
yeah, you
Sorry.
are correct.
I'm gonna read-
Beaverton is opening.
I remember
Very
breaking
short.
those. I
So,
remember breaking
so
the
it
walls.
really means 1 out of 3 permanent shelter sites loses capital investment. It's either Hillsborough or, well, the Tigard one is under construction already. So that it means the Hillsborough one, because it's the third of 3.
I mean, we weren't going to put in any particular specific one.
Logic
Logic
demands.
dictates.
Yes, because we will know most likely within a month and a half which of these scenarios we would have to contemplate.
Well, we've already, I understand we've made commitments to support, but we've already paid the bills for one. We're in the process of currently paying the bills for the second, and the third one that we haven't signed the paperwork for the ink.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate the clarity. Don't like it, of course, but I'm clear.
Yep. And then we have made commitments to 3 of the 4 access centers. So that means one is
Oh, I only knew we had 2 of 4 committed, so this is new information.
Oh, well, we have an RFP out the door that we've been processing through. And I do believe
Wow, that's wonderful news.
third would come back to,
Looks likely.
yeah, it looks likely.
Wonderful news.
So this is where, we've moved forward with a lot of our funding commitments.
Thank you
but
for laying
different
out
stages
these
of-
hard choices. Appreciate it.
So as you keep triaging down, at some point, we need to find a level of savings that represents what it takes to operate a turnkey motel. In addition to one fewer shelter, one fewer access center. In addition to that 0.8, we also would likely have to shut down a pod village.
Do you mean the Washington County? So Washington County bought a turnkey. Family Promise of Tualatin Valley has a project turnkey, and
And such a
Centro has a turnkey. So are those the 3 that you're referring to, that one of the 3 needs to be sold?
or we'd have to find that level of savings somewhere else.
Yeah,
Yes.
I understand. I'm just trying to
Yep, one of those 3.
understand the.
We did not contemplate which one. We just said on
Yep.
average, across those 3, it's between 50 to 60 reduction of those rooms.
Somebody got a new phone, so he's learning how to control it.
I don't even know where the buttons are. There they are.
I'd like to bug you.
There they are. No.
The last, but the most catastrophic is that we've seen on the table in the is 30% reduction, which really does mean we have to really start looking at the folks we have moved into housing who are formerly homeless. We really start reducing the amount of Pop A populations we can move into housing. It starts looking at pretty measures that we would not want to think about, but how do we have to reduce people's rents? Do we have to increase the amount of income there, of how much of their rent is being paid? Essentially, we start seeing more and more people getting stuck into other emergency situations, fewer people getting into permanent housing. And we've eroded our shelter system, which means more cities can't enforce their time, place, and manner policies. And it's looking like we would have to something we've already invested in, capitalize. Well, you would likely, we talk about an access center that wasn't already under construction. And then of course, it would be difficult to choose what a permanent shelter that we've already constructed, what that would look like. And of course, another project turnkey motel. In terms of those reductions, the challenge with project turnkey is if you sell the motel, you have to repay. So we would have to take a one-time hit to then save the ongoing operating expenses that we would not have funds for. So these are really worse. We really hope we don't have to face these potential reductions.
And for
Back to
your,
your guiding
back to your guiding principles, these are the touchstones that Molly's team had to work from. The other last nuggets of Erin's wisdom that I will provide in this is realistically, when we talk about indexing, we are talking about revenue indexing. We are not indexing to the cost to serve. And much like measures 5 and 50, we have found that if we set a rate based on collection, not on cost, we quickly run out of the capacity to serve. And I think the other piece that we are truly concerned about for our county is we have been working to the point where we are running off a stabilized budget and a stabilized system where we are maintaining the services. And as you've seen in these charts, it very quickly becomes a step backwards. And really hard to recover the trust that we have tried to build in our community to say we are going to work to solve this problem collectively. We'll leave it on these guiding principles and back to your board for conversation.
Well, if I could, on the draft guiding principles, just looking at the 12.5 million that we need to find because of the reduced collections.
Because collections didn't match, the trending didn't match what they forecasted a year ago.
Yep. I'm internalizing that it was bigger than I thought it was. So,
And just to make that point, we have created a range because we don't know what the next forecast will look like, which will help inform what we think the new baseline needs to look like.
Can I ask the nasty question? Everyone looks at forecasts and everyone ramps up, but they never ramp up assuming they're going to get everything they're going to get. So did we make the assumption that we would spend it all because we were going to get it up there, or did we hold back and so we're not experiencing the difficulties you're saying? Because you're making it sound like we've spent everything. Well, if we don't get this, we're going to be cutting all kinds of positions because we've committed to these positions. So did we commit before we really had the money? I'm trying to understand what you're saying.
I think you just have to look at, we had essentially 3 years of the revenues collected came in exceeding the initial forecasts. And we were building up a system and we had providers that were growing their programs. So they became more and more efficient of spending their budgets and their contracts all at the same time, the same exact year as the forecast for the first time, not keeping up with the collections rate.
so, but let me add to that.
Yeah.
We adjusted the budget in year 3 to accommodate the fact, no, in year 2, to accommodate the fact that the revenue forecast was adjusted up.
Did you believe it was going to happen?
And it did. We also got criticized for spending 97% of our budget. Okay, so then they came out with another forecast. And I know I told staff, spend as much as you can. Let's make sure we budget. And not only did they budget for the operations, but they were following through on the commitments of building the system. And then late in year 3, because of April and the whole collections, that's when there was a clear signal that we were getting mixed messages. On one hand, be very assertive in spending dollars, so nothing is just quote unquote sitting there. And on the other hand, the economists were reminding us it's a very volatile funding source, and the capital, the income tax choices that individuals and businesses make can cause quite a swing. And they did for the first time.
I think you're explaining well what happened, but would you?
We were getting direction from Metro.
Yeah, but again, in business, you never really assume that you're going to spend up to a forecast because you don't know. And the other problem is you're reliant.
We don't get to determine what we're held accountable to. Metro was holding us accountable,
I know.
unlike business.
But we could have spent less than the 90-some%.
We did.
We last fiscal year, we spent less than what came in.
Okay.
And then it's just, this is the year,
Year 4 is.
year 4 is when we realized also the system was more expensive. Which I realized a couple years ago because of a variety of different reasons. That being said, this has been a year where we are pivoting and we're reevaluating our budget assumptions and our process. So going forward, we are going to look at that lower set of range of that we get from Metro. So as we reset what I call our own baseline, to make sure we don't get in this position again.
So you're pivoting and you're going to be more conservative, but then what if your partners, because you didn't choose your partner, we choose a region, have less revenue in their particular areas, so you're going to lose more revenue?
Well, there's a variety of various reserves that we have also set aside. And it's likely this will be the first year we would probably pull from one of the reserves. We're hoping not have to do that, but that's part of the new way we're going to budget is really think about potentially increasing the amount of reserves to hedge in any kind of the volatility that is now clearly we're experiencing.
And I think what we're trying to concentrate on here is when you intentionally reduce the revenue through a rate reduction, that's where we start to see pretty significant and deep cuts very quickly. And so in this conversation today, really wanting to focus on what those scenarios look like beyond where we are. I think that your board has consistently heard from the SHS folks and there'll be continuing conversations with them about how you go through the budget process and use those forecasts appropriately as you do your budgeting process with the SHS team for next year. So really we wanted to set a baseline, but also then really concentrating on what it is when we sit down at that negotiating table with Metro and other stakeholders who say, oh, a 30% shouldn't be a big deal. That is in fact not accurate from what we have to do and what we have to pay for. So your revenue cuts are not just taking the quote unquote extra money, because there isn't any. We have built that system to stability. You are cutting services. You are cutting our ability to do time, place, and manner. You are preventing us from seeing progress and, in fact, more likely than not, moving people back out onto the street because we could not provide the services to keep them in housing. And I think that's really where those charts are intended to focus, not on the baseline conversation, which is the conversation that happens over the next 6 months through the budgeting process, but really what it means when you further impede our budget.
So moving back to the guiding principles, since that's where I was talking. You've used these draft guiding principles, but we need to get to some adopted guiding principles and fully understanding the need to implement the 10 to 15 million reduction. Okay. On the first one, maintain focus on housing for priority populations A and B. I think this one warrants a slight wording adjustment. Maintain focus on housing for measure directed priority pops A and B. Okay, because with this wording change, we're still committed to the 75-25.
Yeah.
Okay, but the additional that has been implemented to date is where we have to pull back. We need that variable. On the second one, ensure program reductions don't increase racial disparities. I don't see how you can do that. Ensure, right? If you're going to have to pull back on the eviction prevention, which in your prior presentations spoke to how we've been able to in the annual report, year 3 annual report that I dove into and that was just presented at the SHS Oversight Committee, talked about how that helped us exceed our Pop B racial progress. So you have to modify the word ensure. Then prioritize a balanced system so people can move from shelter to housing. I think strive to prioritize, because that's what I see in your reductions things you've tried to do, but it can't be black and white. Your charts show me that it isn't as simple as black and white. Okay. So the next one, keep commitments. I get it. It's with the stable operational funding. So that gives you the variability you need. Check. The next one, balance quality and quantity, person-centered care. You've done that very effectively for the first 3 years. You're striving for it in year 3, and the long-term sustainability. Check. I'm all with you there. The next one, seek funding. I would suggest adding the word continue because you've been doing this. It's not a new thing. You're going to continue to seek funding from other sources. You've been braiding, you're going to keep braiding because it's in our DNA. So if you added the word continue, I'd be check on that one. And then manage impacts with ramp down, check. I'm totally there with you. With that wording as 1 of 5, I'm ready. But I think, folks, given that, as you've seen, I've already emailed to all of you. I did it on Friday. Lynn Peterson is convening a new table. There's 2 Thursday meetings starting this Thursday. Then there's 2 Tuesday meetings in December. That's why staff has laid this stuff out and the impacts. I think we need to take this step, whether it's next Tuesday or as soon as you can make it happen in November, to adopt these guiding principles, because you have to move forward in making year 4 adjustments, let alone how we're being tossed on our head. Right? I need to back up and say this memo, this 15-page memo, well, the 7 pages of text, very thoughtfully and comprehensively done. Big thank you. Big thank you. I do have 5 questions that I need to clarify before the Thursday meeting. The presentation is also very well done. Okay. And I do have a question relative to what Multnomah County has laid out. Once again, I need to do that. I've already talked about Metro's housing grab. I just want to share with my colleagues before we close this topic today, once we get to hearing your questions and comments, I would like us, I already did it earlier, asking us to direct the CAO to have a special city manager meeting on the memo. Because it's not just the land use side, but also these reductions as well. Anyway, I didn't mean to jump the gun. I wanted to make sure we came back to the guiding principles as a group, but also any questions and comments you may have on this whole spectrum. And you may need to have some additional briefings as well. Thoughts?
I'll jump right in. I don't really have a too big of a question because I feel like it's been a long journey. But I do want to say good job to you all staff. You're doing a great job monitoring closely the revenue impact on county services and county residents. So kudos to you all. The question I have, it's actually on this slide, and it's actually the third bullet point. Prioritize balance system so people can move from shelter to housing. What you said, Molly, the explanation you gave when you were on that bullet point resonated with me because you explained it. That is actually beyond, it's even taking a step further before people get to the shelter. And I didn't get that when I was reviewing the material. I sort of had a question, well, what about the people who are in the streets and this potential cliff that's coming of the revenue and the eviction, the reductions of the number of residents that we could help prevent evictions. I'm just wondering, how do we go back saying we're going to help people before they even get to the shelter? So I what you said resonated with me. It just wasn't here. So I just wanted to call out.
I think we may need to add one more guiding principle to that front because what we're losing here, prevention is the most cost effective and most humane. And we see whenever we go to have housing justice forums, we talk to people coming and testifying. It's generally those in active eviction or about to be losing their housing, or they're just trying to get back into getting stabilized again. And that is the piece that as a board, we will have to grapple with. And we need, my personal view, we still need to dedicate some portion to eviction prevention regardless of what system we build out. It's still an important part of the work we're doing. Not have to force people to that.
Depends on how successful the tax rate is. So guiding principle might be a positive one, is to continue to champion the utilization of eviction prevention to prevent additional homelessness.
And we are looking at that Medicaid waiver as a way to potentially help offset.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Five. Commissioner Treese and Commissioner Willie, you haven't had comments or questions yet. Are you on the journey with us?
Yeah, been on a journey with you.
Sure have.
I guess to me, it sounds like that the only opportunity we have for discussion is the governance side of things. So they haven't decided yet what the rate and the indexing and all of that's yet, but they haven't been much listening to us either on that. So I guess of these guiding principles, then I would ask you, how much would it take to maintain those at the basic level? So can we provide basic services on a share of 250?
No. We start eroding our system between 0.95 and 0.9.
Okay, I
That's where it
understand that.
starts getting into, that's when we start at that 0.9 level, we start
Well, I've
likely.
taken a different tack to it. I haven't said,
It wants to, am I correct?
I'm going to the finish line of 250.
Yes. Which of these represents 250, or is that a whole new one to do?
So are we gonna have to go into, and I guess I hadn't based it on our guiding principles, more of what's our priorities of keeping the services that we have active? So just like you said, eviction prevention is, we have to keep making this worse, keep from making this worse. So what would that look like? And we have pods, and you said in one of your scenarios here, we'd have to close one of the pods. So where are you going to put those people? Can't just put them out on the street. So I guess at some point in time, I'd like to see kind of a worst case scenario. What would we do? I know that you thought you were doing it there, but I don't know that that's the worst case.
Worst case scenario at 250, it's another 5 million off of this, less than this scenario.
Our share would be 5 million less than
Yeah.
that. Okay, so we're talking about 27 million.
Minus the 12.5, yes.
Yeah, it's 12.5 plus this 22 plus an additional 5.
Okay.
Essentially, it's a grand
Around
total
40.
of around $40 million of our current 115 million.
Well, it just seems to me like that if we would give these scenarios to Metro and say, this is what you're doing just to our program. So really, are you Are you trying to reduce, eliminate homelessness? Or are you trying to build an affordable housing thing at the cost of homelessness?
Mhm.
It sounds to me like it's the second. So we kind of give them an eyes wide open. This is what you're going to do to us. We're putting more people back out on the street. We have less money for prevention. And you're going to get your affordable housing, but we're going to have more people on the street.
So this doesn't even contemplate an affordable housing use. This is just us essentially having our whole system. Having
But see, but I don't think
You're
that's
correct.
a
We should show
realistic
that.
direction.
You're correct. We should show that. You're absolutely correct that we should try again because we did tell them that in April. I also, through the convening of the four, Council President Peterson and the three chairs, I reinforced it again. I told the story again. We have the opportunity to go in a third time in one of these upcoming meetings of four and deliver these slides and this memo. We probably need to have a cover sheet that's just from us that says, you do it to 250, here it is. If you muck with what we're currently getting, it's all these scenarios.
Okay, and then we go, worst case scenario is you cut it off at 250, all the rest of it goes to affordable housing. This is what you're going to,
No,
so,
the worst case, the 250 is worse than the 30% tax cut.
yeah, I know. So we
Okay.
need to show that. So,
And all these other goodies that they've put into this resolution don't happen either. That's the part that they've, in my words, they put their head in the sand.
so
When you say all
I
the
don't
other
think-
goodies, is that, what is that?
The money for the cities, the affordable housing.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just want to verify that.
And Commissioner, are you saying if they do let's say they go down to 0.9, but they expect this homeless system to go to 0.7? That's what you're suggesting. That could be where they're trying to use then that 0.2 differential into the housing affordable. Okay.
okay.
Is that what you're
I
suggesting?
hadn't thought of it in that fashion. I'm much more simplistic in when they're talking about 250, then what's 250 do to us? I
Oh,
don't know
okay.
what that is along those
We
lines.
could add
there,
it.
but-
We could add
It's,
another
yeah,
line.
it's another line on the chart.
And then I guess my point, Chair, about my perspective
Yeah.
is that President Peterson is hellbound to do this. We can talk to her all day long, and it doesn't make any difference. The Metro Commissioners are the ones that are going to make this decision. That's what we should be doing our messaging. I mean, if you disagree with me, tell me and give me a different perspective on this, because
No, I
guess-
think it's more complicated than that. Yes, you're right about that. And in place of talking to the four county partners, they directed the council president to be their negotiator and to work with staff to bring these policy packages. They've convened this additional table.
And the entire Metro Council supported the resolution.
I get that. Eyes wide open.
Yep.
You can support the resolution. This is what it's going to do to your homelessness. Now, you're going to
Yes.
tell your constituents that we had a great program and we basically had lots of shelters and it's worked really, really well in Washington County. This is what you're doing. You're going to put people back on the street.
So we will update the presentation, and not only will it be going to the full Metro Council, it will be going to every city in Washington County. It will also be going to our existing community-based organizations that are on contract.
And I kind of just follow just one more thing on that. So I had a conversation with, I don't want to name names, with one of the organizations that we're working with.
Yep.
That gets a lot of the eviction prevention. And I said, why are you not writing letters screaming and yelling, saying, this is what you're going to do. Why are our partners that are going to be impacted through this indirectly, I guess, directly through the money and indirectly not being able to provide the services? Why are you not teaming up with us and also sending this message?
What was the answer?
Hadn't thought of it.
Nobody
So-
wants to step forward.
So I'm next. And
Wait a minute.
And while I listened to everything that you said, and I agree with everything that you said, the problem is we're looking at this as Washington County and the impacts of Washington. I think that we're forgetting to look at what's happening in Multnomah County, what's happening in Clackamas County in relationship to being a metro counselor. That's my point. And it looks to me, no matter where we end up, even if it's further up the ladder that we talked about, we're still going to take a hit. And we're going to take the hit for a much larger population base than us. And I believe that that's the situation that we're in. And I don't have an answer to how we avoid that. But I do believe that we need to tell our story. I think we need to tell it strongly. And I appreciate the fact that the chair has been doing that. The place that I want to make sure, while revenue is very important, I also really want to be focusing on HPAC and what the governance structure is, because it won't get any better if we don't. And I'm worried, frankly, about the impact that Washington County feels in relationship to other jurisdictions increasing exponentially as we move forward. So, and we talked about that in some of the components, Erin, that you mentioned early on. And that's where my concern is. So I just want to put that out there as well. And I believe it's the place that we have the opportunity to make an impact as well. I'm not sure that we have an opportunity to make an impact on the tax amount or the distribution. Well, the distribution, we could do that through HVAC. So, or through the formation of that. So I'm just, Chair, you look like you don't agree with that. I was reading your
Given
file.
in so easily on tax
Well,
changes.
Okay, good. And maybe I'm giving in too easily. I fight for the level, but I'm not sure that that we will win in that part. But I do think we have the opportunity to minimize the impact as we move forward.
So what I hear your board consistently saying amongst all of you is that the community needs to know what's about to happen.
Yes.
This is part of how we talk to folks, not just our fellow governing bodies, but realistically, the conversation with the community has to start now so we can set expectations so that we know how to properly organize our partners, those that might have near experience or experience with homelessness. All of these pieces need to be unleashed is the word I'm going to use now. And there are people asking for this, and we've been waiting to actually do numbers. And this chart, sharing it with our service providers, will help them speak to answering your question, Commissioner.
I think they want to know how to best advocate. They know that they're already facing some immediate cuts, or knowing that this is on its way and talking about ramping down with
Because
us.
we've been projecting it.
Mhm.
So
Very
we talk about
first
this
week of August.
exactly, but this is really the first time we're really talking about a number of people,
Amounts and numbers.
and folks, and we're wanting to support our providers, and they're frightened. They are, and they're not sure how they're proceeding in this midst. So I think it behooves all of us, of those experiencing homelessness in Washington County, we have to tell this story, that we will lose ground of what we've gained and the number of people's lives we have transformed in the last couple of years.
We have some work to do before the meeting on Thursday.
Thank you for your super extra time and deep and abiding passion for our community.
Once again, good job. A real-time analysis. Thank you very much. All righty. So go back to the agenda here. Whew, it was ambitious. We still have board and leadership communication and an executive session.
In the interest of time, we have the executive session first. We've got a whole bunch of people sitting here. Then we can come back to board communication. Hate to have them sit through all that.
We don't, no, as presiding officer, if I could finish, what I was going to get at was we have
Great.
to pick a time certain to reconvene in work session. So that's where I want to double check with our county council if you think 30 minutes will be sufficient for the executive session.
Yes, Chair Harrington, I think we can update you in 30 minutes.
Okay, so I would suggest that we go to executive session, and then after we come out of that, we take a break for 15 minutes because we will have been going, and then we move to board and leadership communication. That is my proposal as presiding officer.
I would move, we move into executive session under ORS 192-6602H.
All those in favor, please vote by raising your hand or saying aye. Any opposed? And the motion carries unanimously 5-0. Clerk Moss, if you could please update the